I want to go back to not having live coding happen because I
Mhm.
feel like you are one of the few people that I've ever talked to who truly implements that into their process. And I've worked with some really great hiring managers who still have this fear of, can the person really code? Even though they will have that take home exercise.
Yeah, but you're not learning how good they code. You're learning how poorly they do when other people are staring at them. Accordingly, you've set up people for failure, and you're massively failing candidates. And I've had a handful of friends that I've referred to other companies who've had this experience, and then they wind up at another job within a couple weeks. And I'll send it back to whoever it was and saying, "Hey, your screening practices, which I've told you are poor, have bounced a candidate who is, like I said, literally either at a company that's comparable or a competitor. And this is something that I think you should think about. There's a certain amount of honor system in what I'm doing. And, I don't think I've had somebody that's gone through my screening process. We've wound up hiring who has turned out to be an imposter.
Mm. Welcome to your next tech startup. Today I have with me John Szeder, and he has been an engineering leader for close to 30 years, has hired somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people, directly closer to 500, indirectly closer to 1,000. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. And I'm going to just throw questions at him, and he's going to share stories from hiring software engineers over the years. John, anything else you'd like to share?
I think that hiring is one of the biggest things that most companies do poorly. And I've spent a lot of time trying to coach people on how to hire. And there's even recordings at some companies that they've put into their LinkedIn Learning and their other sort of in-house literature on how to do recruiting processes. So, happy to spread that knowledge far and wide. And I'll tell you some amusing reasons why I do that so frequently and so freely.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, hiring is this weird thing that I don't think it gets nearly enough training or even like conversation or mentorship around. So I'm really hoping by having guests like yourself on the podcast that there's more opportunity for people to learn from people like yourself that have the expertise to share. All right. So first question for you is, what would you say is the hardest part about hiring engineers in today's market? With everything that's kind of changed over the last couple of years in 2025, what would you say are some of the hardest things?
The biggest problem right now is what is in this pile of resumes in front of me digitally these days as opposed to physically. But when you open a new role and you're looking for somebody, you are going to get 500 to 1,000 resumes, and you don't know how many of them are actually good. The problem with creating an easy apply system like LinkedIn has is that it's easy to apply. And I recently did have a role where I opened up something and we had 600 applications within 12 hours with spending $10 on LinkedIn to do a soft promotion for it. In order to be considered for this role, you need to upload your resume in RTF format, rich text
Mhm.
format, which, almost nobody does that ever. So I want to make sure that somebody at least does a save as and can save it to a different format document before uploading it. And out of 600 people, 6 people actually read through the description enough to realize that they needed to save their document in a different format and upload it. It made my life easier because 594 of the people who applied, that in many cases were not remotely qualified. I didn't have to look at their resumes for more than just scrolling through the list of files to say who could follow one instruction. It helped to validate who was just clicking the button because they needed any job.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to filter on.
Yeah, I have not heard that as a technique. I have done more so recently because this is a recent challenge, the overwhelming amount of applicants. Tell me what culturally you bring to a team, like how you are as a teammate. Once I was getting on the phone with people, I wasn't getting any of the weird, you're not sure if you're talking to a bot or a person who's reading ChatGPT. Definitely was a great way to consider candidates based on communication skills.
100%. We'll speak to the low bar a little bit more, but establishing a low bar for making sure that you have somebody that's interviewable is kind of like the new normal. It's like, here's a candidate. Should I be interviewing them? Figuring that out from a yes no perspective with 1,000 resumes or 500 resumes is really hard, but you don't want to set things up as some sort of gigantic obstacle course for a candidate to get into your
Yeah.
business. The thing that I generally run into with a lot of places is I ask people, what's your biggest problem with hiring? And people don't even know the answer to that question, and they haven't sat down and thought about it.
Mm,
Are you getting enough resumes? Are you losing people through your interview
right.
process? Are you rejecting talent you should be hiring because you haven't coached your interviewing staff on what to do?
Mhm.
And I've discovered that the largest problem that I used to run into is the false negative problem, where you've let go of a candidate and said, we're not interested in having the conversation go further with somebody who could actually do very good with this position and could grow from that position as well.
Yeah.
Setting a low bar for those candidates, I think, is really important.
Yeah. I love that you bring that up because the false negative is something that it's impossible to collect data on. There's not like a system that allows it, but for everybody that you rejected at a certain stage in your interview process to track what companies did they end up joining. Every once in a while, like I'll pay attention to those kind of things. But like every hiring manager that I've talked to about it, I don't ever get one who's like, oh, yeah, we screwed up. We probably should have hired that person. Like,
I'm smiling because that's my measurement as well. I will, every once in a while, when I have a gut feeling that we missed a candidate and I see them take a job later, I send it to the rest of the team and saying, this was our failure, right? We should have hired this person, especially if they go to a competitor, right?
yeah. But like, I'm curious. So, as from a recruiting standpoint, and I'm always like, oh, I don't write code. Like, they're just not going to listen to me on this. But you're coming from it from a very different standpoint. Have you been able to get traction on the false negative and like really get someone to kind of rethink and redesign a portion of their interview process because of it?
I've done that a few times very successfully. And a lot of times where I go, the first thing I do is I completely overhaul the interviewing process from top to the bottom.
Okay.
I'm now at the point where I have like 5 or 6 versions of a presentation that I've built for people to talk about what is wrong with their hiring process and what they need to change for it to be successful.
Oh,
A lot of times it is a complete top to down redesign. And the funny part about that, and the thing that amuses me about it, is I've consulted for a handful of companies and told them how to revamp their hiring processes, and then up to and including how you write your LinkedIn post for when you're looking for
mhm.
folks. And 6 months later, they've completely abandoned it after we're done. It's the weirdest thing. I always tell people, when you're interviewing for people, hiring for talent is not grocery shopping. You don't just put a list of what you're looking for and say, this is what we're hiring for. It's fishing, and you have to make it interesting. You have to put a hook in there. And I'm a big advocate of what I call question, call to action. It's like, hey, are you interested in changing the lives of gamers everywhere? Do you have the skills to debug the inside of a 3D software engine and increase its frame rate by 50%? Then we want to talk to you right now. Question, call to action. That's the first thing you need to do to a candidate. The instant you get somebody through that first paragraph and they're excited, you have an interview candidate.
Yeah, no, I really like that. Within revamping, let's start with technical interviews. What
Mhm.
is there a common thing that you would say is you oftentimes tell people to change in their interview process when it comes to technical interviews?
Absolutely. The number one thing I do is I try to break down the real time interview component of any technical screening that people put together. Because, and this is going to sound funny, I once choked in a technical interview in 1990, no, 2003,
Mhm.
I think. And it was such an awful experience that I sat down and said, what was wrong about this? Why was this a bad experience, and how did this go? And should I do something like this? And honestly, even in today's environment, I'm a big fan of screening assignments that are not really tests, but it's more of a, I want you to write me some code, or I want you to show me some code that you've already written and explain to me why this is not you writing a particular piece of code on request, as to why it's comparable. And then I want you to send it to me, and then I'm going to review it, and I will give it a full review and then get back to you with next steps. But I don't think it's reasonable to sit down in real time with somebody and then ask them a bunch of leak code
Yeah,
crap, right? I don't think you learn anything by it. There's 2 or 3 companies that have narrowed their hiring focus to this narrow lens of people who can solve that particular set of problems. And there's a handful of people that can do that. And they always wind up at the top thing at Google and maybe 1 or 2 other companies. And that's it.
Yeah.
That it alienates 98% of the rest of your candidates who could still do great work.
Yeah. And okay, so would you call it a take home challenge?
I say it's a screening test or a screening assignment. It's a code screening assessment, right? I don't call it a test. I especially don't want to call it a test. I don't want to feel like I'm testing
Yeah.
people. I just want to read some code.
Okay.
And
So,
that's literally what I say in the interview. So please send me some code to read, and then I'm going to review it, and then I'm going to give you feedback on it.
okay. And, coming from a I don't read or write code perspective.
Mhm.
So could that, I'm assuming like if someone's sending you code, they also have to explain what the code is supposed to do?
I usually ask them to make me a game, and it's very specific, and so I can play through it and test it, and then I can feel their experience through what they've expressed. And I also, to use your words, I set the bar low. I want a very simple game, something like a Connect Four or a
Okay.
Hangman that's really easy to do, and they can put it together. They can do it in the command line. They can build a web tool. I used this interview process when I was at Zynga, and we sent this out to a candidate who wrote something, and then they submitted it to the Google Play Store. That person got hired. Right, the bar was set very low on
Yeah.
this, and then they're like, okay, I built this thing. I built it in Unity because you guys use Unity, and by the way, I put it live in the Google Play Store. And that last mile of work of figuring that all out and then going through all the steps of doing that, that right there shows somebody who's very serious about their career and their profession.
Yeah.
That I still follow that guy on LinkedIn from time to time, would love to hire him again. He's super talented, but he's very happy where he is.
Yeah. You have been in the gaming space, so having someone build a game
Mhm.
makes a lot of sense. I guess gaming is also like Connect 4 and some of that is so universal that
Right.
it would be fine to like if you were hiring for a SaaS company that,
Yeah.
was in, nothing to do with gaming.
Right.
Would you that?
I'll give you an example of something similar that I would do in that situation. Tell them to write me a once around auction that's going to do 10 auctions, create 3 sample APIs or AIs that you're bidding against, and then player input. And then at the end of it, from 10 rounds and starting with 1,000 units of currency, print out who was the winner of the auction, how much money did they have left. And a once around auction means everybody bids once blindly and then it goes to the winner. And then, whatever your 3 algorithms are, you pick those and you decide what they look like and then put that out there and see what happens. The first thing I do is I try to bid negative 1 million and see if they put a validation on making sure that 0 is the floor of your bid. And you'd be surprised how many people don't do that.
What is the time expectation that you think is reasonable?
This is where I get in trouble with HR departments all around the world. I try to remove the time expectation from the hiring process as much as possible. And I always get into this argument about I want people to do this under the best opportunity that they have. If they have weekend plans, I don't want to put a shot clock on them.
Mhm.
If they are available to do this next week or whenever, until the role gets filled, I will take a submission for anything. But at the same time, I go deeper into the resume stack than the average hiring manager, and I'm willing to look for more candidates and give them more time to find the best employees. Sounds kind of contrarian, but I remember having this conversation at a company mixer one time with somebody from HR and says, John, we love you, but we hate you. We love the results that you get as a hiring manager, but we hate all the things that you've changed here because you want to do things so differently. It's like, we can't have one without the other.
But okay, so you're saying and I agree, like, unless the role is filled, there's no reason to put someone in this kind of like, you have to have it to us within 7 days,
Right.
trying to keep the candidate engaged at.
Mhm.
But in regards to like hours it takes to do the exercise, like that is 4 hours.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Everything that I ask people to do, I try to do myself. If it takes me more than 4 hours, I don't think it's a good example of a code screen. I think it is reasonable to ask somebody to do 4 hours of technical assessment for a job. I don't think that that is a crazy ask.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable after like enough has been put into them. Like I don't, you know, ideally to me you have recruiter screen, engineering manager interview, and then if you're going to do a take home. Cuz
Yeah. For me, my process is usually I look at the resume, I arrange a phone screen, then I do the screening, and then we go to internal interviews and proceed from there. but it's usually after I've spoken to a person and I think there's enough reason for me to say, I think this is a valid candidate.
Okay.
And the other piece that I do on top of that is once I get the submission, I give it a full code review and I return it back to the person who sent it in, usually with a score from 0 to 10. I've given a surprising number of 4 out of 10s on my code screens, and I tell people it's going to be a very hard assessment. And I've also offered jobs to some people who've gotten a 4 out of 10 because sometimes the points that I deduct are like, this was out of your control. You built this thing and it didn't deploy, and you're missing some instructions on how for me to deploy it and test it. So you got 0 out of 5 on execution. And so if you still do that, but you get 4 out of 5 on code quality, that's not necessarily your fault, but you're going to learn something about how to send in your stuff for a code screen in the future. Right? So there are times when I will say, hey, you know what, this still makes sense to move forward, even though your score is incredibly low.
And then, okay, so you're doing that assessment, you're giving everybody like real feedback, which I think is,
100%. And people are
yeah,
surprised. They're like, wow, this is the most incredible feedback I've ever gotten. And it makes me sad that more people don't
it's
do
so
that.
rare.
It's really good to give people that kind of feedback because, it's a conversation, but also I've hired a lot of people who, over the course of the number of jobs that I've had 2 or 3 people who've applied to me at a new company that I didn't hire at a previous company. It's like, hey, I see you got a new job. I remember your screening process. I would love to talk about a role here. And,
And then,
that's happened more than 10
yeah,
times.
no, I'm not surprised. I think giving people that level of feedback and approaches, these are humans. We know, like, we humans don't know every single thing. So, like, you can see, like, okay, this person's really good at this. Their career, they
Mhm.
haven't specialized in this yet, and being able to understand that. But one thing, with as many hires as you've done over your career, you have to be training people to do these assessment grading and getting it back.
Yep.
Okay. Because I was just like, there's no way it's just you.
I've done more than half of it. To be honest, I'm very good at it and I'm very quick at
Okay.
it. And I do get hired to go through. I've got a folder on my PC full of people's code screens from different companies because I'm very good at doing it quickly at this point. But I've probably trained about 10 people over the past years. This is the type of thing that you need to do as a director of engineering or a senior manager of
Mhm.
engineering. And it's not something you can do very easily in the first 5 years of your career because you're still building so much muscle memory for other parts of your job. I take hiring very seriously as the most important thing that I've ever done professionally successfully. It is the first thing I do when I've taken a job in the past. Understand the hiring pipeline, who is in front of the jobs at email for the company, and who is looking at my resumes. I posted an article to LinkedIn a little while ago about this, is that the number one thing that I do that really irritates HR departments is I remove every applicant tracking system and other human being in front of my resumes before I look at them because there's so many people that don't know what they're saying no to. I would rather take the raw blast of noise and spend that N seconds per resume, whether it's 5 or 10, looking at everything. Because if I have to look at 1,000 resumes, that's still like 6 hours of time,
Mhm.
and 6 hours of my time to find a candidate who's going to be worth, 3 years of productivity on a $200 million product, I think is really important. And I'm happy to coach people for the things that I look for, and I'm happy to help people understand that. But the first thing I do is I take away everyone who's just throwing away resumes and I tell them they have to stop. And, like I said, it earned most favored nation and most despised nation status with a number of HR departments over this. And I'm unapologetic about it. The applicant tracking tools that basically take out resumes is my biggest bane of my existence. The number
Yeah.
of people who are qualified for work that are not even getting a chance, and I've talked to people who in this environment have sent out a resume less than 24 hours later, they get an autoresponder. No human being ever looked at that,
I
right?
do.
It went through some kind of
I
system,
actually, I
but yeah, I think you're of a similar
Yeah,
mindset of the
like, I
importance of
do try.
this.
I think it takes an insane amount of time. Sometimes I'll come in because, like, I'll do, like, fractional head of technical recruitment. Like, there's, like, 500 applicants over the last 3 months. I'll send out something, "Hey, are you still interested in the role?" And I'm not gonna review the resumes from 3 months ago because, but then everything
Right.
that from the point that I come on forward, I'm reviewing that content.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I know that it isn't the norm. And so curious with that, like, okay, so I will say one of my most recent absolutely drives me crazy on a resume is and I haven't hired for a Java engineering role in close to a decade. The
Hmm.
number of resumes that refer to themselves as a Java developer in very large, bold print, potentially larger than their name. Um, and like, and to me, like, at my core, I'm just like, I don't even want to look at this resume because you
Mhm.
like zero thought is my feeling on it. Like, this
Yeah.
isn't a Java position.
Es- Especially if it's a different
Yeah,
technology,
it's
right?
been a different technology for a
100%.
decade. Like, I have not hired Java engineers.
Hmm.
Thousands of resumes that I've looked at that highlight I'm a Java developer is that's my number one pet peeve on LinkedIn open to work is zero information. Like, engineers
Yeah.
settings like, well, how am I supposed to know if I'm messaging you for the right role if you don't tell me anything about
Hmm.
yourself? It's
Right.
your favorite and not so favorite for resume.
My least favorite thing about resumes is somebody who doesn't know how to size their resume properly.
Okay.
If I can get my resume with 29 years of experience down to a page and a half, anybody can get their resume down to a page and a half. I can't get it to exactly 2 pages and it drives me up the wall. It's either going to be more than 2 pages or a page and a half, and I'm going to err on the side of less information. Somebody who sends me a 5 page resume
Uh-huh.
that murders my soul. Unless you have patents on there and you've been a public CTO at a very large company with publications and a bunch of scientific stuff that you've done over the
Mhm.
industry, if you have a 5 page resume, your code is going to look atrocious because you don't know how to edit yourself.
How interesting that you think about it as your code. I think about it as your ability to communicate is
That's right. Well, code is
right.
communication. It's communication to the person who's replacing you at this job.
But, like, I
It's
hate page resumes because they don't tell me anything. Like, one-page resume is fine if your career is less than 5 years. You should have a
mhm,
two-page resume or a page and a half, whatever. But if you
mhm,
don't have strong bullets, I want to understand, do you understand if you're a certain level as an engineer, business impact,
mhm.
technical impact, and do you work with other
Right.
humans? Like, your 3
Correct.
to 5 bullets should be and ideally, like, with business
Yep.
impact, improve this from X percentage to X percentage, save the company X amount
Mhm.
of money, like those.
And my favorite resume to get is a bad resume by a good engineer. I am really good at spotting a good engineer with a bad resume, and I will hire that person and I will say, I'm so glad you're here. First thing I'm going to do during your ramp up week is I'm going to tell you why your resume is awful and I'm going to teach you how to fix it for your next time around.
So, okay, what is one of the things that you identify of a good engineer with a bad resume?
I wish I could explain it. And I've been trying to teach this as well for a number of years. I don't have enough of them in my hand to look at them all and say, what's the common pattern? But I could pick up a resume and look at it. And after a couple moments, I'm like, you know what? I think this is a good engineer who doesn't know how to write a resume. And I don't have a better description than that, but it's like a spidey sense thing. And I wish I could articulate it because I bet you it would help so many people.
Let's go back to the okay, so when we're talking about this like ideal process, revamping the process, we have you're speaking with them or the engineering manager is speaking with them, then you're sending them a take-home assessment up to 4 hours,
Yeah.
build a game type, very
Mhm.
straightforward.
Yeah. Or write a simple API.
And then after that, what's the next ideal technical step?
Usually at that point you want to bring in the rest of the team and people they will be working with and set it up so that you have a number of people on a culture fit panel and a number of people doing a domain specific technical assessment that is not the same thing as a test, right? You just want someone to have a conversation with them about, what is your experience with the platform that we're using, or somebody else might be asking computer science domain specific questions like, how's your experience with big O scaling for large systems, or how comfortable are you with embedded software if you're doing stuff that's in devices, and focusing it on different things, a general computer science theory, and asking something that's not quite a leak code question, but something that is from a specified list of questions to make sure that they understand the theory. Somebody's going to target our particular domain, somebody's going to target the language and just make sure that they're comfortable with things. And if you're a Python developer, that you're familiar with PEP 8 or whatever.
They're 3 technical conversations, and I wouldn't even say they're necessarily like because to me, like, a technical deep dive interview, which is one that I think is a good idea, is, like, you're
Mm-hmm.
really, like, diving deep into their project that they've done, but these are 3 broader interviews that are technical conversations.
Correct.
Okay. And so you're not doing systems design, you're not doing any live coding, you're not doing like a debugging exercise.
There may be a whiteboarding thing for systems design if it's for an architect level candidate,
Okay.
but very, very few. We don't ask people to do live coding exercises. There's no way I would ever do that. And I think being able to put together a simple whiteboard of a system for a very senior candidate is, you should be able to do that in your sleep at this point, right? I was challenged with doing a mobile authentication system when I was going to Zynga for the hardest person on my panel. And I was thrilled because I had just finished building one of those a couple weeks beforehand. He did something that I don't enjoy in an interviewing process, which left a bad feeling in my mouth because he was tackling some of the same problems. I don't like asking candidates stuff that is very close to what you're doing as work and
Um,
that you're kind of getting free work out of them. That to me feels a little distasteful.
Yeah, that's such a hard line when we were talking about the gaming. Okay, well, that works when you're in the gaming space. But if you're in the logistics space, maybe the exercise should have something to do with logistics and like, kind of that whole focus of we want to present like real problems that we've faced.
Mhm.
But there's this fine
Yeah,
line
there's a
between
fine line.
that, yeah, and then doing it in and I think sometimes it could be the exact same problem that the candidate's being asked, but it's really how it's being presented. Like, this is a problem that we
Mhm.
solved last year, then the candidate probably feels safe about it. But even then, I'll sometimes have candidates be like, well, they spent months on it. I spent an hour on it. Like the knowledge base is so
Mhm.
uneven. It isn't the right
Yeah.
question to be asking. And then
Yep.
the team is in the midst of trying to solve the problem, then the candidate can feel used.
Yeah.
And that's always an awful experience for a candidate to have.
Yeah. And people need to understand hiring is a two-way street. Certainly there's a lot of candidates out there right now, but even with feast or famine for hiring, I always say it's a two-way street, and part of your job as a hiring person and part of the process that I set up is a vetted list of interviewers, which includes them participating in a coaching session plus one or two shadow interviews with other interviewers to see how it goes, to make sure they're fully aligned with it and making sure that it is a tasteful candidate experience.
Yeah.
There's one company that I've interviewed at 3 times over 20 years where I've had people on the interview panels. From time to time, I do interview, and I get the feeling that people don't want to be participating in these interviews, and it's a horrible feeling.
Um,
And a lot of times, they are people that are interested in getting out of that room as fast as possible, and they want to discharge their obligation. I don't know if they're doing hard time in interviewing as a result of breaking something in production, but their interview experience comes across as awful when it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to ask you some questions. Well, clearly you don't know the answer to that. This interview's
oh my
over. And it's like, wow, why are you doing this to other human beings?
Well,
You could do this so much
yeah,
better.
I from a recruiting perspective, typically when I was an in-house recruiter, I would get pinged pretty quick once someone put in their 2-week notice.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, okay, we're gonna need to backfill that role. But like I would oftentimes be the person who was like, I don't want them interviewing. Like,
Yeah.
do you really care?
Yeah.
Like at that point, they can still conduct great interviews, but I think it's bad practice.
Agreed.
So,
I made sure that it was an understood privilege to be an interviewer. And I've had a few things that happened both at Zynga. Number one, we stopped interviewing on Mondays and it sent HR into an apoplectic fit. And that's because we had so many production issues that spilled over from the weekend that needed to be resolved on Monday that key critical staff were never available to do interviews. And there were a handful of those folks that didn't want to interview who were on the interview list because they needed it for promotion consideration. And then they were horrified when they got booted off that list. And they're like, well, I need this to get my next career level up. I'm like, well, then you need to show up at interviews.
yeah.
Right. And so, in order to make consideration for them, we stopped interviewing people on Mondays because we had a lot of people who were stuck in war rooms trying to solve production issues. And then, just making sure that we had the space to do that and could intelligently do an interview without it showing up as this, oh my gosh, I need to get back to this war room because something is happening, was a bad candidate
Right.
experience.
Yeah.
And then making sure that everybody who's on that interview panel takes it seriously and understands that's one of the most important things they can do with their day is growing the business through hiring.
Yeah. No, I think that's messaging that isn't universal. But okay,
And you'd be surprised how fast this stuff loses its significance in institutional memory without reinforcement.
I want to go back to the that issue of like not having live coding happen because I feel like you are one of the few people that I've ever talked to who truly implements that into their process. And I've worked with some really great hiring managers who still have this fear of, can the person really code? Even though they will have that take home exercise, there's still this, but they could be cheating on that. But I hear the answer is no, because if you have a conversation with them about it, it's very clear if they did or didn't write the code. So you don't have to have them,
Yeah.
like write code live, but they still always have
Mhm.
this one additional on-site interview that involves some aspect of live coding.
Yeah, but you're not learning how good they code. You're learning how poorly they do when other people are staring at them. Accordingly, you've set up people for failure, and you're massively failing candidates. And I've had a handful of friends that I've referred to other companies who've had this experience, and then they wind up at another job within a couple weeks. And I'll send it back to whoever it was and saying, "Hey, your screening practices, which I've told you are poor, have bounced a candidate who is, like I said, literally either at a company that's comparable or a competitor. And this is something that I think you should think about. There's a certain amount of honor system in what I'm doing. And, I don't think I've had somebody that's gone through my screening process. We've wound up hiring who has turned out to be an imposter.
Mm. Yeah. And I
So
think
I've caught two plagiarists in the process. One of the coding exercises that I do give, there's a really bad implementation on the internet that I can spot it from a mile away now. And I'm like, hey, you basically just stole this from an online tutorial. This is an instant fail.
yeah. Right. And I've talked to people who've had people go through really intense interview processes and they end up not being the right candidate at the end. So it's impossible to create a perfect hiring process, but I think it's very easy
Mm-hmm.
to create a hiring process that you reject a lot of great engineers.
Yep.
So, okay, so we've
Mm-hmm.
talked about kind of and the number of engineers that I feel like I've had conversations with that would be like, "Oh my God, tell me when John's hiring. I want to interview." Like it's such a better process. Like what you're doing, I feel like is so much more like what candidates want. Okay, so let's talk about anything else on the technical side that you think is important to highlight in regards to like when you're thinking about designing those processes.
Well, I think the big thing that I would say that maybe some folks who are building their interview processes could take away from this conversation is that think about the interviews where you've been on the other side of the table and think about how you would react to your own interview processes. I started off as a very hardcore developer at Research in Motion when it was a 30-person startup up in Canada, and my code screening question that I sent to candidates, I'm embarrassed by it. It was brutal. Right. It was, consider that you have a 12-bit stream of data, write a piece of code that will give me an algorithm to return whether or not you have frame sync on a packet with n bits of confidence. It was, very complicated
Mhm.
code, and it was what you would do in the day-to-day job, and it was something that I cleverly solved a year before that. But boy, oh boy, that's very different than what I put in front of people now.
Yeah.
Sitting down and thinking about the things that you've done and on the other side of the fence and the things that you would ask people in your interview, just think that's a really important part of the process, and saying, hey, does this feel good and does this feel reasonable? And running it through the lens of this broke me when I ran through this interview process, or I've gotten feedback that this was a distasteful process from a candidate. Sit down and look at that and say, do I really have to do that?
Yeah. One of the things that has been challenging, particularly when I was hiring for this one startup, was most of the decision makers had been there about 7 years and like outside of college. And it's
Mm,
like, you have no idea what it's like to be a candidate. So,
yeah.
like, how are
Mhm.
you going to have empathy as a hiring manager for another
Mhm.
job? But
Right.
yeah, that's a hard one, the empathy piece. Okay, so the non-technical interviews, what would you say are a couple of, I know it changes from company to company, values and things like that, but
Mhm.
are there a couple of things that are critical to focus on regardless of what startup you're hiring at?
That goes down to seniority, right? You want to have one culture fit person for less senior candidates, but you're going to double up on the interview process between technical and non-technical when you get to a very senior staff member, because they're going to have a lot of non-engineering touch points in the
Mm,
organization. How do they interface with other people? How do they handle crucial conversations with
mhm,
coworkers that they need to be exerting peer influence on, and figuring out all of the soft skills and where are they in their career cycle is a big part of that. For a junior engineer, that doesn't matter as much, right? You're going to be training them to a lot of those things and coaching them on it and making sure that they understand the rules of the road for where they need to be in their career is very different from you need to have figured this out because as we're building this software and we're shipping things, we can't be in the middle of coaching you through how to interact with the director of product with whom you have a disagreement.
Right.
You have to understand the agree to disagree and how to make the commitment and move on. I think that's stolen from the Amazon way, but it's certainly true.
Yeah. And now for that junior-ish, whatever, first 5 years within their career engineer, I think like ability to learn, like ability to take feedback, those are all things that are still pretty critical. They are still having meetings with stakeholders. But I do think that there's still some very core pieces to just being in a startup, and I think
Mm-hmm.
learning and feedback everybody has as a core part of their ability to be successful in a role.
Yep.
Okay.
The three things that I look for are curiosity and resilience.
Yeah.
There is no third thing. If you are in an interview with me and you're not asking any questions, I don't know why you're here.
Okay.
Right? And resilience is one of those things that is really hard to teach. You have to have determination and grit, and you have to exhibit it somehow, and you have to tell me how you've done that through the process of the interview. Being able to have that resilience and to understand that you can get through something and find dig down deep to solve a problem that needs to be solved. That is one of the hardest things to find and one of the most important things I look for.
And how are you typically screening for that? Like, is it coming through like a variety of questions that you're asking, or is there a particular?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like the situational assessments. Tell me about the hardest challenge that you've had
Mhm.
professionally. How did you resolve it? One of my things that I did at Research in Motion is we had this thing where we had a hardware problem in a prototype we were building, and there was no way we could fix it. So everyone went to the coffee room and was about to give up on it. And we had to basically register this device as, logging into a network. We had this little simulated piece of hardware sitting in our office and we couldn't physically make it work because we couldn't ramp up the transmitter due to a hardware defect in the unit to transmit fast enough. And then I watched it. And I'm sitting there looking at the signal on the oscilloscope. This is like old school 1990
Mhm.
stuff. And I'm like, hey, this is a repeatable pattern. I can figure out where we are in the pattern. I can push a bunch of no ops into the signal processor that will push us a predetermined amount of time into the next wave so we can register on the network, and it worked. And I did that. And I went to the coffee room. All these people are all like sad and depressed. And hey, we didn't get this thing to work. And I'm like, hey guys, just came to get a cup of coffee. Just wanted to let you know we've registered on the network. And they're like, what? It shouldn't have been possible, right? You have to be able to find something that you could do to demonstrate that you could solve really hard problems.
Mhm. I think when people are preparing for interviews, have like thinking through what are the great examples, because sometimes people have those great examples, but I am like pulling it out of them.
Yeah.
And then I get hesitant about like moving that candidate forward because I'm like, well, if I had to pull all of this out of you, and I know that like most interviewers aren't as good at pulling information that they want to gather from the interview as I am. And so
Mm-hmm.
I that's one that I haven't completely come to a good decision on yet. And I'll coach, I'll say like, "Hey, like that was a
Mm-hmm.
great story that you told. I really had to get that out of you. Like you've got to think about those great stories and have them ready to share in your other interviews."
Brings up an interesting point that you made there. It's like interviewing is a coachable skill.
Yeah.
But I've taken a lot of random interviews over the years just to sit down and see what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, one of my thinkings around starting this podcast was that aspect of feeling like you need to stay up on interviews, and ideally, like that
Yes.
I am creating content that allows people to think through how to interview effectively so that they are able to learn and grow from that.
Right.
But yeah, it is interviewing is definitely something that's coachable that you get better with practice.
Right.
I appreciate you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I would love to have you on as a guest again in the future, just because I think a lot of the ways that you're thinking about hiring is, I just wish I could take your hiring process and just be like, You have to follow John's way.
Yeah. And I've tried, it's really funny. I have a number of mentees and I do speak at some schools. And I
Mhm.
also tell folks at the schools, it's like, hey, if you ever need somebody to do some practice interviewing for
Mhm.
some of your students, I'm happy to talk about how to set that up because, it's a tough market out there and there are things you can do to stand out. And I approach a lot of my interviewing I might not hire this person now, but if they're fascinating and interesting, I would like to see if I could make our paths cross again. And I tell people
Mhm.
that sometimes, like, hey, sorry this didn't work out, but I would love to talk to you again in the future because I think that you've got a lot of talent and I don't know what we missed here, but I would like to hear from you in the future.
Yeah, that's a great from, decades of being in the space, those paths cross again and keeping those doors open. Well, thank you again.
You bet.